I always get a bit hesitant about talking about carbon credits in the SAF space because it is such a nascent industry, as you're explaining, and there's a hell of a lot of terms and nuances to each of this. So I'm going to give my impression of what it is at this early stage, but just take it with a pinch of salt that things are changing daily. But to kick off, a little bit about CNF then, if we could just do the next slide, Eleanor. Brilliant, thank you. So my background is in chemistry, and I met my co-founder Alistair at COP26, which is the climate change conference that happened in Glasgow in November 2021. And it was such a phenomenal experience in terms of being able to be surrounded by tens of thousands of super motivated people, all wanting to be part of the solution to solving climate change. And around a year later, Alistair and I actually decided to set up the business. So that was mid-2022. And since then, we've done a huge amount of work in terms of designing a facility to produce sustainable aviation fuel. You can see a graphic of that on the screen. And the key highlights from this project is that we are UK based. We're headed up to the northwest of England, to West Cumbria. Our facility produces 25,000 tonnes per year of neat SAF, which requires blending with traditional fossil fuel, but it's certainly a really positive step in the right direction in terms of being able to use sustainable fuels on a commercial setting. And then on the left-hand side, you can see in terms of feedstock requirements, we are 35 acres of land, 100,000 tonnes of CO2 per year, and 120 megawatt grid connection, which is pretty beefy in terms of a facility. Where we're at is that we've completed the feasibility and the pre-feed design stage. What that means in engineering land is that you can prove that it's possible and you know roughly the diameter of the pipes that you're going to be using. But the next stage that we need to do is working out that in a lot more detail. And part of that is understanding our revenue stack, of which carbon credits will become a really important part. Just a little bit more on the tech. If we could do the next slide, Eleanor. Perfect, thank you. So we have three core inputs starting at the bottom. So electricity, our electricity needs to be low carbon, so that we can classify the fuel that we output as sustainable aviation fuel. So that can include renewables, but it can also include nuclear and hydropower and things like that. Water is a big feedstock for us. Fortunately, Cumbria is not a water deprived area. But in terms of siting and thinking about siting these facilities, obviously that's a consideration that we need to take into account. And then the most important feedstock for this conversation is the carbon dioxide. Where are we actually sourcing that from? So for us, we've made the decision to use biogenic carbon dioxide. So that can be anything from natural sources. So for instance, paper mill sludge. It could be the off gases from an anaerobic digester. And the changes in the carbon market in the UK are certainly influencing those feedstock discussions. But essentially, once we've got our water and we've got our carbon dioxide, we run an electric current through both of those. We remove the oxygen atoms from those molecules, leaving us with syngas, which is hydrogen or carbon monoxide. We put that through a Fischer-Tropsch reactor to create a waxy substance, removing a further oxygen. And that leaves you with your hydrocarbon, your waxy hydrocarbon. You can then upgrade into your desired output. So we've tuned it for sustainable aviation fuel, but there's no reason why you couldn't tune it for marine diesel or other types of fuels. So it's essentially, rather than using dinosaurs plus time to create fuel, we're using CO2 captured from the atmosphere and a lot of engineering. Next slide, please, Eleanor. Thank you. And so I suppose the opportunities that CNF sees for carbon credits, the fuel that we produce has an emission savings of 89% carbon equivalents relative to traditional fossil fuels, which is obviously a huge saving. And we'd love to increase that as we optimize the facility and as we can use ever increasing green electrons for the process. And in terms of the SAF certificates that we then produce, because of our choices of biogenic CO2, and we also use direct air capture CO2, the quality of the certificates that we produce is really, really high, which makes it super valuable when we're thinking about trading those certificates. And the way that that actually works is that we have, if we think of the fuel itself, we've got the physical molecules that we will sell at a certain price, and then we have the SAF certificates. And the thinking from the UK government, although it's not yet passed into law, is that we will be able to decouple those two things, which means that we can then sell our fuel independently of those certificates, which when you're thinking about logistics, import, export, etc., is a really, really valuable thing to be able to do. And also, and just on the final bullet point, it gives you that wider market access. The UK is a fairly small island. We have a limited amount of need for SAF at the current mandate levels. But if we think about our business model in terms of selling that to Europe more generally, then there's a huge opportunity there. But obviously, there's always risks associated with that. So the fact that we are dependent on that legislation being passed into law is really unhelpful when we're trying to think about things like underpinning our business revenue streams and developing those cash flow models and all of that sort of thing. And so one of the key topics on the CNF agenda is interrogating those carbon markets even more so that we can get a really good understanding of how many different options we have available to us through those certificates. So it's not necessarily just the SAF certificates, it's thinking about, as Eleanor mentioned earlier, who those customers for that could be. Is it the fuel companies who are the obligated parties, or do we go more down the corporate side in terms of scope 3 offsetting? So there's a lot of work for us to do there. And then, as mentioned at the top, SAF is, well, sustainable aviation fuel as an industry is a really emerging one. And if we think how traditional refineries have worked to date and how the sale of fossil jet fuel, it's one type of product with only really one pathway, in that you stick a straw in the ground and you remove your fuel. Whereas now we've got a plethora of pathways, all producing sustainable fuel, all using different quality feedstocks. And so actually coming up with a standardized approach to being able to sell those carbon credits and those certificates that are produced is a real challenge. And as pathways are being approved over the coming years, that's going to be a really key consideration. So to summarize, I suppose the opportunity for CNF as a business is that carbon credits offer a lot of different revenue streams and a lot of different opportunities to have carbon reduction impact. And it also forces us to be better as an industry by actually considering the quality of the feedstocks that we are using to make our SAF in the first place, which will then obviously have a knock-on effect on the revenue, because if your feedstocks are high quality, your revenue should follow. So it is certainly a good thing, but it is very much an emerging market.